I now give the floor to Mr. Danny Haiphong.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Council, Mr. President. Today I am here as a journalist who has dedicated the last 10 years of my life writing about and speaking out against the long record of human rights abuses and war crimes committed by my country of birth, the United States. I don't consider this a hobby or even a profession, but rather a duty to all of humanity and those who want to see a better and more peaceful future. I am here too as a U.S. citizen who has witnessed tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars go to funding and arming a proxy war against Russia, while people in the U.S., ordinary people, suffer from rising levels of poverty, homelessness, suicide, and economic insecurity. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1958, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. On June 2nd, 2023, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave a speech in Helsinki where he stated that military support for Ukraine must be prioritized over diplomacy. The argument goes that a steady supply of arms to Ukraine will turn the tide on the battlefield and force Russia to the negotiating table. Blinken is supposed to be the U.S.'s top diplomat, not a champion of escalating conflict. However, the sentiment that he communicated has been a foundational feature of the justifications given for the West's continued flow of arms to Ukraine. The facts, however, undermine Blinken's assertions. First, U.S. and Western arms are anathema to resolving conflict. The U.S. is the biggest arms exporter in the world, comprising around 40% of all global arms sales. These arms have been instrumental in the bloodiest wars of our last 2 generations, including the U.S.-led invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. U.S. arms play a major role in escalating tensions in the Korean Peninsula and the military encirclement of Russia and China, which has ushered in a new Cold War and all of the risks that come with it. Second, it was never Russia that needed to be forced to the negotiating table. Back in December 2021, if we remember, Russia provided draft proposals of security guarantees to the U.S. and to NATO that were meant to serve as the basis of dialogue and negotiation. They were summarily rejected. By late January 2022, the U.S. announced 200,000 pounds of what was deemed quote-unquote lethal aid to Ukraine in an obvious signal of escalation. In April 2022, both U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin traveled to Ukraine just weeks after a peace deal fell through and admitted that the U.S. was all in on winning the current fight in Ukraine. What they meant by this was that the U.S. was fully committed to corralling its own military arsenal and that of its NATO partners in a proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian. The absence of diplomacy in times of conflict cannot but lead to escalation. That Russia's security, and for that matter, the security of the entire world, has been dismissed so summarily by the West is proof enough that the ceaseless supply of arms to Ukraine endangers peace. Weapons to Ukraine do not represent some kind of quote-unquote arsenal of democracy, as some in the U.S. foreign policy establishment tout. NATO countries have already provided $40 billion in weapons to Ukraine over the span of this conflict, and we have witnessed these weapons become heavier, deadlier, and more provocative, stymieing the possibility of a negotiated settlement to this conflict. Many of these weapons have landed on the black market to drug cartels, criminal organizations, and indeed neo-Nazi and fascist elements, many of which now make up parts of Ukraine's armed forces. Furthermore, NATO has essentially armed Ukrainian army after Ukrainian army at the expense of its own arsenal. The New York Times sounded the alarm 8 months ago that Ukraine is now the location of an artillery and tank war, the likes of which the West was not prepared to fight long term. And if this is the case, then rational minds may assume that the West would cease its supply of deadly weaponry. But the opposite has occurred. The U.S. approved of sending cluster munitions to Ukraine last month, the same munitions that continue to kill and explode on civilians in Laos decades after the U.S. invasion there, and which have long been condemned by over 100 countries worldwide. I'm a journalist and a geopolitical analyst, not a military expert. But such experts in recent months have come clean about the limitations of Western firepower. Camille Grand, former Assistant Secretary General of Defense Investment at NATO, stated that, quote, "a day in Ukraine is a month or more in Afghanistan," end quote. She is referencing the fact that Ukraine burns through nearly half of the artillery produced in the United States in a single day, per month in a single day. Former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, James Stavridis, acknowledged last May that analysts were correct to assume that Ukraine is burning through a year's worth of U.S. production monthly. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and U.S. President Joe Biden have both acknowledged these weapons shortages, with Biden admitting during his announcement of cluster munitions for Ukraine that, quote, "this is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of ammunition, and we're low on it," end quote. And I'm not even touching on issues of personnel, training, and other logistical items here. All of these problems have come to a head as the last several months saw Ukraine's spring counteroffensive gain much discussion. For months, political and military officials in the West regularly broadcasted to media outlets of an oncoming, victorious offensive that would take large amounts of territory from Russia. Yet at the same time, Ukraine, and in particular its head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky, repeatedly demanded that the West increase its supply of heavy weaponry, including air power. Zelensky has blamed over and over the West for its lackluster supply of arms in conjunction with the months-long delay of this counteroffensive against Russia. Now, this counteroffensive is in its third month, and the results have been disastrous. Around 30% of NATO's weapon supplies to Ukraine have been destroyed. The death toll on the battlefield is staggering. An estimated 43,000 Ukrainian forces have been killed, and reports are surfacing that local morgues in Ukraine are seeing nearly double the bodies since the counteroffensive began. And for what? The optimism of Western officials and diplomats has waned, with many now acknowledging that Ukraine has not even penetrated Russia's first defensive line. So I think the better question then is cui bono? Who benefits and what benefits from Western arms being poured into Ukraine? Certainly not Ukraine if the results of the counteroffensive and the conflict as a whole are the measure. And it certainly isn't global peace instability either. For all the benefits that come from an emerging multipolar world, the incessant militarization of Ukraine pushed by the West is helping fuel a worldwide economic slowdown and the potential of major power conflict, which could very well take on a nuclear character. So a simple answer to this question is the arms industry, the corporations that have profited mightily from this conflict. Shareholders of the largest military contractors are being paid handsomely since the conflict began as profits soar. The top 25 Western military contractors have seen their revenues increase by 11% over the past year to $212 billion. Arms sales are expected to increase to $450 billion in total by the end of 2023, an increase of $47 billion thanks to the Ukraine conflict. This bonanza in arms sales is thus making the slim minority of the richest people richer, while the rest of the world is left to resolve the myriad of problems left in the wake of this conflict. One of the primary responsibilities of the United Nations Security Council, as stated by the UN Charter, is the maintenance of international peace and stability. Ongoing Western arms sales to Ukraine are not only a violation of the UN Charter, but they also reveal the geopolitical realities that undergird this conflict. Indeed, it would be simplistic to claim that profits alone from Western arms sales are what is driving a wedge in the cause of peace. The United States, where I reside, has a long record of waging unilateral military conflict on a global scale in contravention of the UN Charter, with 800 plus foreign military bases, 11 command structures, and a public military budget of nearly $1 trillion US. There is now an open conflict within the U.S. foreign policy establishment over whether Ukraine and arming Ukraine to maximum effect is a good idea, or whether other military matters deserve more attention, with a leaked memo from top Air Force brass claiming that the U.S. must prepare to go to war with China by 2025. So Ukraine thus finds itself in the eye of a much larger storm, that of a U.S. policy of great power competition, or what is better termed great power confrontation, led by the United States. Peace and stability is not possible so long as the West pursues a foreign policy of unilateral interventionism in Ukraine to fulfill a larger goal, a larger geopolitical goal of unipolarity. This policy runs completely counter to the principles of the UN Charter. The continued flow of arms to Ukraine is a violation of Article 2, Section 3 of this charter, requiring member states to resolve conflict in a peaceful manner, and these arms only prolong the conflict with devastating consequences. The U.S. and its Western partners, and whoever goes along with it, must learn to operate within the framework of international law, just like all other member states, or the world will face the continued threat of instability and war, no matter the efforts of this Security Council and other United Nations bodies. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.